I watched A Time for Burning for the first time a year ago. I was so inspired by it and so curious about what happened after the movie, I attended a worship service at Augustana Lutheran Church while visiting Omaha last May. It was fascinating being there and seeing in person the beautiful brick facade and wooden ceilings, and walking through the famous doors where Bill Youngdahl stood to shake hands with his congregation. I was so pleased to see how inclusive Augustana had become. Their marquee outside in bold letters read, "Progressive Christian Thinking, an Inclusive Faith Community." Their wonderful female intern pastor, with purple hair, gave the sermon that day and spoke of the importance of inclusion and equity. A month ago, I was back in Omaha and had the great pleasure of sitting down with Augustana's head pastor, Jan Peterson, and talking with her about the movie and what the past 56 years have looked like for Augustana. I asked Pastor Jan, why did Augustana Lutheran Church bring Bill Youngdahl in when they knew what he was up to in the civil rights movement? Her answer was, the Youngdahls were a very well-known family. Augustana thought having a pastor with the Youngdahl name would be a feather in their cap. Bill Youngdahl was the son of former Minnesota governor and former federal judge Luther Wallace Youngdahl. Bill's Minnesota roots run deep. He graduated from Roosevelt High School in Minneapolis in 1945 and attended Gustavus Adolphus in St. Peter. He also helped Augsburg College in Minneapolis start an urban studies program. Reverend Bill Youngdahl passed away in 2012, and his obituary reads, "Bill dedicated his life and his ministry to social justice and sharing God's message of peace." Although Bill Youngdahl was not able to accomplish what he was hoping at Augustana in 1965, he kept his commitment to racial justice and went on to make an impact across the country. Reverend Youngdahl was at Augustana for a very short time. In fact, this whole movie was filmed in only 2 weeks. A council member had been out of town, missed a council meeting, and when he came back, all of this had taken place. The movie doesn't show that there were many congregation members at the time that supported Bill Youngdahl's vision, and many congregation members were upset the documentary only showed one side of the story. Bill Jersey wanted to include someone in the movie who could really express the feelings of Black people in Omaha. The mayor recommended he go to the Spencer Street Barbershop and meet Ernie Chambers. Bill Jersey did not expect to meet someone as powerful and moving as Ernie Chambers, someone who dared you to take him off his argument. In 1970, Ernie was first elected to the Nebraska legislature and went on to become the longest-serving state senator in Nebraska history. In fact, it's because of Ernie that Nebraska created term limits, because they wanted him out. Ernie served as senator from 1971 until 2009. He had to leave because of term limits, but was then voted back in and served for another 8 years from 2013 to 2021. He represented his district in North Omaha for a total of 46 years. Most of his career, he was the only non-white senator. If you're as inspired by Ernie Chambers as I am, I highly recommend following him on Facebook and watching him in action on YouTube. Pastor Jan is also very fond of Ernie Chambers. When I asked her about him, she smiled and said, he has done very good things for his district in North Omaha, and he hasn't changed one bit from the documentary. He still wears short-sleeve sweatshirts everywhere, even to chamber. He is not a white man's suit guy. Ray Christensen had a career in photography and animation. He shifted his focus to filmmaking after appearing in A Time for Burning. Bill Jersey, the producer, became a lifelong friend and filmmaking mentor to Ray. Ray began making documentaries for companies and organizations in Omaha. Later in life, he moved to Minneapolis and made a film about the people of Minnesota. Ray's passions for telling human stories took him around the world, to Africa, where tribes work to preserve their precious water supplies, to East Germany, where he brought to life the historic impact of Martin Luther. Ray's legacy is summed up in a belief he shared throughout his life: never lose your sense of wonder. Always be curious. I believe it was this curiosity that led Ray to his change of heart in the film. Reverend Victor Schoonover came to Augustana Lutheran Church in the late 1960s, not long after Bill Youngdahl left, and he was a longtime pastor at Augustana. Pastor Vic brought inclusivity to Augustana long before they became a Reconciling in Christ church in 2004. He brought in the first female pastor in 1976, and Pastor Jan is the fourth female pastor since. Vic Schoonover was the Omaha director of Lutheran Metropolitan Ministries for many years, and he started Project Embrace at Augustana in 1968, which is a summer outreach program for children in the community. Project Embrace is still around today. Augustana still has a couple members in the congregation that were part of the youth group that visited Calvin Memorial members in the documentary. I drove by Calvin Memorial in North Omaha and was sad to see the beautiful building was condemned. It was in a neighborhood that is in the process of being rebuilt, probably thanks to Ernie Chambers. I was inspired watching a group of people working together near another church down the street. A Time for Burning was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 1967. In 2005, A Time for Burning was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress for being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. Augustana shows A Time for Burning every few years and does a discussion forum. Bill Jersey joined them for the 50th anniversary showing of the documentary in 2016. In the words of Bill Jersey, A Time for Burning really isn't about Bill Youngdahl, Ray Christensen, Ernie Chambers, or Augustana Lutheran Church. It's about how difficult it is to bring about change when situations, beliefs, attitudes, values, and opinions are entrenched. This movie celebrates moments of being with one another respectfully, openly, and honestly, and it shows unless we are willing to take positive action in the presence of our fear, we won't bring about change. Thank you.
To help us move from 1965 to 2022, we've invited a panel to share with us what's changed, what hasn't, and how we move forward from here. I'd like to invite the panel to go ahead and step up to the table so we can see you. I'm going to start with Mark Abelson, who might look familiar to you. He has been directing, accompanying, and leading worship and theater experiences in the Twin Cities for almost 20 years, having worked with organizations such as the Minnesota Boy Choir, the National ELCA Global Music Educators Program, and Minnetonka High School Choir and Community Theaters. Mark has served as Director of Worship and Music here at Mount Calvary since 2009, directing the Chancel and Handbell Choirs, the Saturday Night Worship Band, as well as overseeing the worship, music, and outreach staff. He's on the board of Theater 301, an outreach community theater ministry at Mount Calvary, while serving as a musical director for many large-scale musical theater productions. Mark is also our intern pastor as he attends St. Paul Lutheran Seminary. And Joe Davis in the hat. Wave to us, Joe. Joe Davis is a nationally touring artist, educator, and speaker. He employs poetry, music, theater, and dance to shape culture. He is the co-creator of Just Move, racial justice education through art, and has keynoted, facilitated conversation, and served as a teaching artist at hundreds of high school and universities throughout the country, including New York, Boston, and most recently as the artist in residence at Luther Seminary, where he earned a master's in theology of the arts. His newly released book of poetry, We Rise Higher, is a collection of poems and prayers for graduates. I hear they're sold out online, but he's got a couple with him tonight. I'm buying 4, so if you want any, you better hurry up and get to them. Reverend Dean Seal, thank you, hello. He has been pastor at Shepherd of the Hill Presbyterian Church of Chaska for 7 years. He taught religion at Augsburg University for 11 years, and before that was executive director of the Minnesota Fringe Theater Festival. While in seminary, he wrote for A Prairie Home Companion and spent many years in comedy in New York City. Fun fact, he can sing La Bamba in Norwegian, Hebrew, and Japanese. He is the author of Church and Stage, a book about the use of theater in the congregational setting that includes his Christmas play, The Three Wise Men and One Wise Guy. His recently submitted dissertation is about Dr. King's Letter from a Birmingham Jail and Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, Harlem Renaissance Theology and an Ethic of Resistance, and how these teachings offer the white church a chance to save itself through Black spirituality. Lauren Williams. She is the training manager and executive administrator at Marnita's Table, a nonprofit organization that provides practical tools to build sustainable community engagement, leadership, and collaboration across race, class, culture, and other means of self-identity. Lauren graduated from the University of Minnesota with a bachelor's degree in communication studies and a minor in leadership. As a South Minneapolis native with family roots in the St. Paul Rondo community, Lauren has been engaged with community service organizations since childhood, developing her leadership on the shoulders of strong community leaders. Please join me in welcoming our panelists tonight.
I have been asked to kind of facilitate our conversation, so I'll be asking questions and direct them to one of you, but all of you are welcome to chime in at any time. So Joe, the first one goes to you. Sarah mentioned the change of heart we see in Ray in his journey in the film. What do you think happened to Ray? What did it take for him to have that change of heart? And how can we make that same transition and not remain silent?
Thank you. I think that's a really great question. Oftentimes reflect on how this work of change only moves at the pace of relationship. And what we see happen to Ray really exemplifies that. A lot of these moments of transformation that he experienced only happened when he allowed himself to be in deep relationship with people who were different from him. He went to that conversation and he was starting to ask questions. You saw him kind of wrestling with these questions, and he was like awakening to something new, right? But that wouldn't have happened if he hadn't allowed himself, created that space and that time. And I think that's what we have to do even today, right? Because we're moving at this machine-like pace. We're just trying to survive capitalism or trying to make it through our day. We don't slow down to pause, to breathe, to deepen those relationships. And that's something we saw Ray do. And he had this moment I thought was really profound and really beautiful where he was confessing. He was like, this is what we have to do. If we want to see this reckoning and this reconciliation, we have to confess, right? When we recognize something that's inside of us that needs to transform. And I was asking myself, the fact that he had that humility to say that, and that vulnerability and that courage to speak that and to embody that. And he was saying, I'm just an infant in this journey. I'm just starting off and I'm scared to death. I'm terrified. And he admitted that. But then you look at how his journey progressed, right? He didn't shy away from it. He stayed committed to it. And he came back again and again. As we read, I was read afterwards how he went on to become a filmmaker. And he did work in Africa, working with folks in Wales, and he continued to deepen those relationships. And a lot of times we want to see this type of change happen just instantaneously, overnight. And he even said himself, it took me at least 2 weeks to even get to where I am now. But I talk about this metaphor. As a poet, I'm a sucker for a good metaphor. And we want to see these big changes happen overnight, but we can't plant the seed and eat the fruit the same day. We got to cultivate the soil. And that's what deepening those relationships looks like. This just happened in 2 weeks. This is 2 weeks, and it was still highly controversial and uncomfortable and awkward and messy. But you imagine over years, right? And that's what this is going to take. Because the situation that we're in now didn't just happen over a short amount of time. We have generations and generations of violence and oppression. And so in order for us to disentangle this trauma and this wounded, to heal from this woundedness, it's going to take a lot. But we can see one example. I think that Ray is one example of what's possible. And yes, I think one of the questions in here was, do you think we can make this transition? And I say yes, because he showed us that it's possible. And I don't think he's the only example too. I'll end with this, but I think it's important that we see throughout history white folks who have been in solidarity. We see multiracial coalitions of folks who have worked towards healing and justice, because oftentimes we only see one side of the story. And in Lutheranism, we have this belief of summa justus epicatus, right? The saint and the sinner, how both are possible within us. We have the capacity to do harm, but we also have the capacity to contribute to healing, right? And so I think we need more examples like Ray and see that, yes, there were white abolitionists. Yes, there were white freedom fighters. Just as there was then, we need to carry forward that tradition now. Because we see the black folks. We know the black folks have been about the liberation and justice, but we also have to see that we need to do this together. Because if we want collective liberation, we need the collective. Every single person has a role in this. This isn't about black people versus white people. This is about everybody versus racism. And we all have a role to play in that. We all have healing. We all have different levels of power and privilege, but the question is, how are we healing ourselves and using our power and privilege to contribute to collective healing and liberation? I think that is the call that Christ calls us into through deep relationships. So shout out to Ray, shout out to everybody who's showing up and doing this work.
Yeah. As Pastor Kyle sometimes says, why don't you preach?
My church on Easter Sunday, by the way.
Dean.
Yeah.
Ernie Chambers says, Christ never hesitated to take a position on moral issues regardless of who might oppose them. MLK makes a similar argument in his letter from a Birmingham jail. As Christians, what do you think we are failing to understand?
And what can we learn from the black church? I think the best known public action that Jesus did is called the incident at the temple, where he overthrew the tables of the money changers and the dealers in sacrificial animals. But it is also misunderstood. Jesus says that they have turned the temple into a den of robbers. Now, the den of robbers is not where they are robbing people. It is where they go afterwards to stash their loot. So this demonstration is a protest against the temple authorities, the Sadducees, who are collaborating with the Romans and prospering from it. It's that deadly mixture where access to power diminishes the effort to create justice. It's an old problem. Jesus is actually quoting Jeremiah, who says in the voice of God, "Has this house, which has been called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight?" Crossan and Borg's commentary in the book The Last Week summarizes this issue. Quote, "Do you think," charges God through Jeremiah, "that divine worship excuses you from divine justice? That all God wants is regular attendance in God's temple rather than equitable distribution of God's land? And in our case, equitable distribution of the wealth of the nation." Quote, "In that context, the meaning den of robbers is very clear. The people's everyday injustice makes them robbers. And they think their temple is their safe house, their den, hideaway, or place of security," end quote. In the Civil Rights History book of the 1964 effort to register black voters in Mississippi, God's Long Summer, the Baptist pastor of the largest congregation in the state, Reverend Douglas Hudgens, preached a gospel of individual salvation and personal orderliness, construing civil rights activism as not only a defilement of social purity, in other words, the mixing of races, but even more as simply irrelevant to the proclamation of Jesus as God. The cross has nothing to do with social movements. It's a matter of personal salvation, he said. In other words, it's about the individual's personal relationship with God, which is found in its purest form when it's not distracted by anything that's going on in the world. In my mind, this ignores everything Jesus ever did. Because Jesus was about healing people and feeding them and welcoming them and breaking boundaries between those who are supposedly righteous and who is outcast. Jesus went out. In a letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. King described the white church that did not support his efforts as the congregations that hid behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. You can just hear his voice when you read that. In other words, it's about getting to heaven, about perfect attendance and tithing without dirtying our hands, about social justice issues. It's escapist Christianity. Bonhoeffer's experience in the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem was that the worship services were both mournful and joyful, reflecting reality and being connected to the lives of the people in the community. They fed people and clothed them. They educated them and trained them, and they inspired them. They were deeply embedded in the cultural flourishing of the Harlem Renaissance. Bonhoeffer found that the Union Seminary, where he was at, to be dry and lifeless in comparison, and said that the worship experience of the black church, he had finally found a tangible experience of the Holy Spirit. The spiritual life that Jesus taught was about the life of the community and the enriching experience of caring for each other and being cared for. Those who are able have to advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves, like our church does with affordable housing. We nourish ourselves in community, then we are sent out to serve others. Apostle means one who is sent out, and disciple means someone with spiritual discipline. That is the yin and the yang of lived theology that prepares us to serve others. In the words of Cornel West, never forget that justice is what love looks like in public. It is our job to bring the love of God to this love-starved world.
Lauren, as someone who focuses in your work with Marnita's Table and hosting diverse meals today, what might the couples from Omaha have discovered about each other if they had dined together? And do you still experience this sort of reticence in your work today?
Well, I think the obvious answer is they would have found that there are similarities, but there are also very real differences. When we bring people together, we always do it over food for a reason, and that is because people don't traditionally fight with the people that they sit down and have a meal with. Your body cannot do those two things at the exact same time. So it is very intentional, and that is the word in our model, intentional social interaction, that I want you all to think about. When engaging in dialogue, being intentional is the number one thing that you can do. One of the things that I've been hearing is that, we can learn from the Black church, but just today, twice, a church that I grew up in that was all Black, and then another church that was pretty mixed, they asked me how can they be more inclusive for the next generation because people are leaving, because they don't feel safe. So I think that this is an everybody issue, and that we are all trying to not only be inclusive across race, but also culture and age and socioeconomic background. There's so many different bridges that we need to make. And I want people to know that we all get it wrong. Just last week, and just so that you know, we bring thousands of people together every single year. And last week we had a couple of events where one person said, I don't like that you use the word mixed. I feel like it's similar to saying mulatto, and it's a derogatory term, but people in other communities, like in South Minneapolis, that's how people identify, right? So for what works for one person may not work for another person. Another person said, I don't see the word disability written in your questions, and it makes me feel like you don't see me. And we just had to say, thank you. Thank you for saying that, right? We don't have all the answers. And when someone tells you a way that you can support them, a way that you can see them and make them feel included, just do it. Just say thank you. One of the things that we always talk about is cross-cultural humility, that we often use the word competence, but you can't know everything that there is to know about someone who's different from you, and that's okay. You don't have to pretend like you need to know everything. Just have the humility to accept when someone tells you maybe a narrative that is different from what you've always had, or when they share either about their history or their present, and just be willing to engage in relationship.
It's common, well, especially in a Lutheran church, to go into spaces that say things like all are welcome. Talking through that, is that enough in your estimation, and how do we fall short of living up to that kind of blanket statement that we see in many congregations? Any of you?
I want to underline something that Joe said, which was that change moves at the speed of relationships. A lot of churches say all are welcome. We have a special outreach to the LGBTQIA plus community, and we have a couple people who said, you know, I went to churches that said they were welcoming, but nobody said hi to me. Or once they found out I was gay, then it was kind of like they kind of moved away. So it has to be an actual commitment, and that takes risk. One of the things that keeps coming up in these things is that it's not up to the black people to teach the white people, okay? Some of them, like the professionals here, are engaged in that kind of outreach and they're good at it, but it's the white people's responsibility to teach each other. And if we're around somebody and they say something and it makes you uncomfortable, we need to speak up, and we need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable so that we can make that point and make that change, okay?
Yeah, hop in and just wanna affirm that. I think I've heard it, you say we're gonna mess up, I heard you say we're gonna mess up, and I wanna say that again, like, I promise you it's inevitable, you're going to mess up. That's one thing that I can guarantee, but that's how we learn. One of my favorite quotes is, you can't learn and look good at the same time, right? Like this work, this of a relationship, and it's just transformative, it's powerful, it's beautiful, but it's also really messy. And you know, we're gonna say things, and then we're gonna do something different. Like, so many of us, myself included, have this gap, right? Whether you want to call it a value gap or a belief gap, we say something and then our bodies respond differently. And so I think the work is, like, I do a lot of body-centered work, a lot of somatic skill building. One of my teachers is Resmaa Menakem, who wrote the book, My Grandmother's Hands. He talks about a path to racialized healing and how to pay attention to what's going on in our bodies and the bodies around us. Because we know how to say all the right things. Like, we've reached the intellectual zenith of racial justice. We've read every book, right? And we know all the perfect things to say. We can even take a lie detector test. And we'll pass it to say we're not racist or we're not sexist or homophobic. And still, we can cause harm to other people because of how our bodies respond, how our bodies act, right? We've been immersed in these cultural patterns historically for generations. And so, to me, I think it's a practice. And I use the word practice again and again and again because I think we're called to this life of practice. Use the word disciple, right? Spiritual discipline. I think the church is uniquely positioned to be the training grounds for that practice, for us to practice how to be together, how to be community, how to have a transformative culture. We come here and we say the things, but we also do the things. And we open up ourselves into new ways of being together. And we have to come back to it again and again and again, having rhythms together. Right? As an artist, I think a lot about rhythms and repetition and how, you know, in song and in poems, right, we come back to things again and again because it starts to get stuck inside of us and in our bodies, and it becomes behavior and it becomes culture. And so how do we create the space for that in our churches? I think we have to be active and intentional about it, because otherwise we're just going to go along with the status quo. We're just going to do the same things that we've already done and be complacent and compliant. But if we're active and intentional and carve out the time and space, like having those meals together, having those conversations that we're not used to having, and you do best what you do most. So you got to get your reps in. You got to get that practice in. I think that's what it's about. It's about that spiritual discipline, that spiritual practice. How do we have this communal response to being together in new ways? I think that's also an invitation that Christ calls us to, because that's what Christ did with the disciples, with his best friends. He broke bread with them, right, and built community and built culture with them. So, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I totally agree. Intention and practice. Two of the things that we always say is the platinum rule instead of the golden rule. Treat people the way that they want to be treated, and also that instead of all are welcome, try to use this space was intentionally created with you in mind, and to think about what that looks like when people are approaching a space, right? If you were to say, oh, this space is open to everyone, but there are nothing but steps leading up to the door. Maybe someone who has challenges with mobility is not actually able to enter that door, right? So thinking about doing your research and your reflection and thinking about who are you wanting to welcome into this space, and what are the ways that you can reduce the barriers to allowing them to be in that space authentically in their bodies.
Well, I hate to do this, but I'm following the rules. It's 8 o'clock. And so we are going to bring this to a close, but I would love for you to please join me in thanking this amazing panel of leaders in our community. Of course, there's time for more conversation after we kind of officially wrap it up. Just a few announcements for you as you leave this evening. As we mentioned, Joe has his book here for sale. Do you want to just say a little bit about your book? Yeah.
Sure. So it's entitled We Rise Higher, and it's a collection of poems. I wrote it with graduates in mind, but it's really for anyone going through different transitions. There's poems for navigating heavy emotions, poems for celebration. And so, yeah, for me, I talk a lot about that practice, right? Something you can come back to again and again. And it's not just poems, but there's also invitations after each poem that invite you into like some sort of spiritual or embodied practice. And so it's just an offering I have for folks to, something to come back to and offer a little bit of inspiration, a little bit of hope, a little bit of healing. So
cool. And they can check that out.
Yeah, I'll set up a table. Yeah,
okay.
I have some books, and I'll set them at the table
Awesome.
back there. So,
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
If you signed in with the yellow sign-in card, if you could please leave it in the basket on your way out. We are curious on how we reached you and how you came to us this evening. And then there's also a display of books that you have access to in our library here at Mount Calvary. So check those out and feel free to bring them home with you, sign them out. Also, just a shout out to our Reconciliation and Advocacy Council on Equity, our race team who put this event together. All the hard work from Heidi and Kara and Sarah and Chad and the whole team, Tony, Jim. Awesome. So, and thanks again to all of you. This concludes the official program, but we invite you to stay if you are able to. Turn to your neighbors, reflect on the conversation questions that we're going to post on the screen, and our panelists might be able to stick around for continued conversation. Have a great night, and thank you.
Thank you all. I'm not going to run, but
You got to go.